Enemies in the Korean underworld usually disappear. That's the rule. You lose, you're erased. Your name stops being spoken. Your phone stops ringing. Your people scatter. But when his rivals lost, they didn't die. They got promoted. Let that sit for a moment. The men who plotted against him, the captains who tried to undermine him, the lieutenants who swore they would replace him, they didn't end up in shallow graves. They ended up running his companies. And that is what made him more dangerous than every killer around him. Because a man who destroys you ends your story. A man who rewrites you owns it. So the question isn't whether he was ruthless. The real question is this: why spare enemies at all? Was it mercy? Or was it control wearing the mask of mercy? How do you dominate an underworld that respects bloodshed without shedding blood? To understand that, you have to understand the system he was operating in. Korean organized crime did not grow in isolation. After the war, during rapid industrial expansion in South Korea, power shifted quickly. From military hands to business elites, from the streets to construction sites, ports, and nightlife districts. In that vacuum, hierarchical syndicates formed. Structured, disciplined, ordered. They functioned in a way similar to the Yakuza, with ranks, codes, internal tribunals, and strict loyalty chains. Locally, they were known as kangpai. They weren't chaotic street gangs. They were organizations. And inside those organizations, reputation was currency. Violence wasn't random. It was instructional. If someone betrayed you, you made an example of them. If someone challenged you, you removed them. If someone tried to take your territory, you ended the dispute permanently. That was the expectation. That was how authority stayed intact. In a structure like that, mercy could look like weakness. Hesitation could invite revolt. Forgiveness could fracture command. Yet he chose a different path. When rivals failed, he called them into private rooms. He listened. He offered terms. Not surrender. Employment. Not punishment. Position. And each time he did it, the balance of power shifted, quietly but permanently. Other bosses built fear. He built dependency. Other leaders cut threats out of the system. He absorbed them into it. Which brings us back to the question that unsettled even his own men. Why did he refuse to kill? And more importantly, what did he gain by keeping his enemies alive? The first time he was tested, it wasn't by an enemy. It was by someone who had eaten at his table. A young lieutenant. Sharp. Ambitious. Trusted. The kind of man you send to negotiate sensitive deals. The kind of man who knows where the accounts are buried and which captains are restless. And that was the problem. Ambition without patience is dangerous. Word reached him quietly. Meetings were being held without permission. Whispers about new direction. Promises of faster money. Faster expansion. Faster dominance. The lieutenant wasn't planning a direct strike. He was building an alternative. When the evidence was finally placed in front of the council, the room went cold. In organizations like this, betrayal has a single solution. Removal. Not debate. Not forgiveness. Execution. The older captains didn't argue emotionally. They argued structurally. If you let this stand, one of them said, you invite 10 more. Authority in their world had to be defended visibly. The lieutenant was brought in. He didn't deny it. He framed it as a vision. Said the organization was moving too slowly. Said he could attract new investors. Said he could build something bigger. It almost sounded reasonable. The council was ready to end it there. But the boss didn't raise his voice. He didn't slam the table. He asked a single question. If I give you the resources, can you build it under my name? The room shifted. The lieutenant looked confused. The council looked offended. Instead of ordering his death, the boss offered him a partnership. Control of a new logistics arm. Legitimate contracts. Access to capital. Under one condition. Absolute public loyalty. The decision stunned everyone. A man had just tried to fracture the structure, and he was being rewarded? But this is where most people misunderstand power. Let's pause the story. Why would a leader spare someone who challenged him? The answer is not kindness. It's leverage. This is called debt-based control. When you punish someone, you create resentment. When you eliminate someone, you create silence. But when you spare someone publicly, you create debt. And debt is heavier than fear. Fear controls behavior while you're present. Debt controls identity long after you leave the room. By sparing him in front of the council, he did three things at once. First, he demonstrated absolute authority. Only someone fully secure in power can afford mercy. Second, he reframed the betrayal. It was no longer rebellion. It was ambition redirected. Third, he placed the lieutenant in permanent psychological obligation. The man who expected death was handed an opportunity instead. That kind of reversal changes a person, because now the lieutenant couldn't rise without the boss. His success would prove the boss right. His failure would prove the council right. Either way, he remained tethered. Mercy, when performed strategically, creates deeper loyalty than fear ever could. Fear makes men obey. Debt makes them defend you. And defend him he did. Within 2 years, the logistics arm became one of the most profitable divisions in the organization. Ports, warehousing, transportation contracts that blurred the line between legal and underground operations. The same ambition that once threatened the structure now strengthened it. More importantly, the lieutenant became something unexpected. He became the boss's most aggressive protector. In meetings, he was the first to silence dissent. In negotiations, he was the one who pushed hardest for loyalty. In internal disputes, he sided with the man who had spared him, every single time. The council eventually stopped questioning that first decision, because they began to see the pattern. The boss hadn't ignored betrayal. He had converted it. And in doing so, he sent a message far more powerful than an execution ever could. Challenge me, and if you're useful, I won't destroy you. I'll redefine you. The underworld understood violence. They were still trying to understand. He didn't believe in waste. Not wasted territory. Not wasted leverage. And definitely not wasted talent. Most leaders remove rivals to eliminate risk. He saw something different. He saw inventory. When a rival fell, he didn't ask, "How do I erase him?" He asked, "Where does he fit?" That was the shift. The first major test came after a territorial dispute that could have ended in public collapse. Everyone expected retaliation. That was the rhythm of the streets. Insult, response, escalation. Instead, he called a meeting, not to negotiate peace, to negotiate a purpose. The rival leader arrived expecting terms of surrender. Instead, he was handed projections, construction permits, import routes, nightlife expansions. "You understand distribution," the boss told him calmly. "You understand loyalty networks. You understand pressure. Why waste that?" The offer wasn't forgiveness. It was repositioned. A legal front under centralized oversight. Revenue share structured through layered holding entities. Access to protection and capital in exchange for integration. The rival hesitated. Because surrendering territory is one thing. Surrendering identity is another. But survival instinct is powerful. He accepted. And that's when the transformation began. Former street enforcers were retrained as logistics supervisors. Territory captains became nightlife managers. Distributors transitioned into procurement coordinators. The surface changed. The hierarchy did not. Violence removes enemies. Conversion multiplies assets. Every rival absorbed came with insider knowledge, supply routes, informal alliances, personality profiles of competitors. They weren't liabilities. They were intelligence upgrades. And because they had once fought the system, they understood exactly how to defend it. That made them dangerous in a new way. Traditional dominance operates on subtraction. Eliminate the threat. Reduce the opposition. But subtraction shrinks the ecosystem. Conversion operates on multiplication. Absorb the threat. Increase capacity. Each absorbed rival strengthened the structure. And here's the deeper advantage. A converted rival is often more loyal than a lifelong subordinate. Why? Because they remember life outside the system. They understand the instability. They've compared both worlds. And when someone chooses stability after chaos, their loyalty feels earned, even if it was engineered. He didn't just spare people. He rewrote them. That's the real strategy. If you eliminate a rival, their followers carry resentment. If you promote a rival, their followers reinterpret history. He saw potential in him. He rewards strength. He builds leaders. The narrative shifts, and narratives shape allegiance. He gave former rivals new titles, new responsibilities, new public identities. The man who once ran underground shipments was now director of operations. The former street coordinator was now regional expansion lead. Same skill set, different frame, and identity is frame-dependent. You are who the system recognizes you as. When the system upgrades you, you begin to see yourself differently. And once someone adopts a new identity, they defend it. He understood something most leaders ignore. You don't control people by threatening their life. You control them by defining who they are allowed to become. But not everyone adapts easily. One absorbed captain struggled. He missed autonomy, missed direct command, missed the raw clarity of dominance without oversight. He complied publicly. Privately, he questioned, because conversion feels empowering at first. Then it feels containing. And that tension is inevitable. When you rewrite someone's identity, a part of them resists. The question becomes, is the new life worth the loss of the old self? Most chose yes, because elevation is seductive. But a few hesitated. And hesitation is dangerous in a system built on alignment. Which leads to the inevitable question. What happens when someone refuses the new life? What happens when a man would rather risk destruction than surrender authorship of his identity? That answer wouldn't come with gunfire. It would come with suffocation. And the lesson would redefine what power truly means. Not everyone accepts a second chance. After the success of his conversion strategy began spreading through the ranks, offers of new life became expected. Defeat no longer guaranteed death. It guaranteed a meeting. Most took the offer. One didn't. He was older, established, ran a gambling network that had survived 3 internal wars and 2 government crackdowns. He wasn't reckless. He was proud. When the boss called him in and laid out the proposal, integration, legal fronts, protection, capital, the man listened without interruption. Then he declined. Calmly. I built my territory without you, he said. I'll keep it without you. There was no shouting, no threats. The council watched closely this time. They were waiting to see if mercy had limits. The boss nodded once. And that was the end of the meeting. No gunshots followed. No midnight raids. For a few weeks, nothing happened. Then small inconveniences began to appear. A supplier who had worked with the rival for years suddenly found better terms elsewhere. A shipment was delayed because a port manager decided to review paperwork. 2 mid-level captains declined to renew their agreements, citing new obligations. Individually, each disruption was explainable. Together, they formed a pattern. Credit lines tightened. Venues lost protection agreements. Security contractors shifted loyalty. The rival wasn't attacked. He was isolated. Let's pause here. This wasn't punishment. This was environmental control. Instead of confronting the man directly, the boss adjusted the ecosystem around him. Every organization depends on oxygen, capital, access, trust, movement. Remove the oxygen, and even the strongest structure weakens. This is called the environmental control strategy. You don't attack the person. You remove the air around them. The rival still had his office. He still had his men. But his influence was thinning. Investors became cautious. Associates stopped taking his calls immediately. Rumors began circulating that aligning with him meant losing access to larger contracts. The boss never publicly criticized him. In fact, he said very little at all. And that silence did more damage than threats would have. Because when pressure is invisible, it creates doubt. Was this temporary? Was it a coincidence? Or was every door quietly closing by design? Within months, the rival's network began shrinking. Not collapsing, shrinking. Gradual erosion. Loyal men left for better opportunities. Cash flow tightened. Expansion plans froze. Still, the boss never moved against him directly. He waited. Eventually, the rival requested another meeting. This time, he didn't speak about independence. He spoke about sustainability. He framed it as a partnership. He suggested collaboration. The boss listened, just as he had before. The offer on the table was nearly identical to the first one. Legal investment channels. shared contracts, protection under a larger umbrella. The rival accepted. Publicly, it looked strategic. Privately, it was surrender. But here's the critical shift. It didn't feel like surrender, because no one forced him at gunpoint. No one dragged him into compliance. No violence marked the transition. He walked in on his own. That is the pattern flip. When submission feels voluntary, resistance dissolves. The rival could tell himself he chose stability. His men could tell themselves they upgraded their position. Outsiders could frame it as smart consolidation. And the boss? He gained territory, manpower, and reputation without creating a martyr. The council finally understood the depth of his method. Executions remove threats. Isolation reshapes them. By controlling the environment, he made defiance expensive and cooperation rewarding. And the most powerful part? He never had to raise his voice. In a world that measured strength by how many enemies you buried, he proved something different. If you control the air, you control the outcome. By the time the second rival accepted his offer, something had changed in the underworld. It wasn't louder. It was quieter. Conversations that used to revolve around who would be next started shifting toward a different question. What does he actually want? That uncertainty unsettled people more than violence ever did. In most criminal hierarchies, power is simple. You cross the line, you pay. The punishment is visible. The message is clear. But with him, there was no clear script. One man betrayed him and became an executive. Another resisted him and ended up expanding under his protection. There were no public executions to rally around. No funerals to turn into speeches. No blood to point at and say, "This is why we fight him." And that's what began to terrify the underworld. Because you can prepare for brutality. You can't prepare for restraint. If he killed you, your allies would have something to unite around. Anger is glue. Grief is fuel. But if he absorbed you, what were they supposed to protest? Opportunity? Promotion? Security? You can't build a rebellion around a raise in status. Let's pause and examine what was happening beneath the surface. Killing creates revenge cycles. Every execution plants a seed. A brother. A cousin. A loyal captain who decides the score must be settled. Violence echoes. It rarely ends cleanly. Rehabilitation does something different. It rewires incentives. When a rival joins your structure and prospers, their former allies begin reconsidering their own loyalties. Not because they are afraid, but because they see advantage. Fear controls through threat. Obligation controls through benefit. And the benefit is harder to reject. He wasn't building fear. He was building an obligation. Men who once opposed him now owed their relevance to him. Their new income. Their new legitimacy. Their protection from law enforcement scrutiny. Their access to contracts they never could have secured alone. Each act of mercy created another man whose success depended on his continued dominance. That kind of loyalty is complicated. It isn't emotional. It's structural. And structural loyalty is stronger. Over time, something even more powerful happened. Potential challengers stopped framing him as an enemy. They started framing him as a gatekeeper. If you wanted to grow, you didn't overthrow him. You impressed him. If you wanted survival, you didn't hide from him. Y0, you negotiated with him. That shift changed the psychology of the entire ecosystem. The underworld thrives on lines. Us versus them. He blurred the line. You weren't entirely against him. You just weren't integrated yet. And that ambiguity made collective resistance almost impossible. You can't unify people through hatred if the villain keeps improving their lives. You can't call for war when your former rival is now driving a better car under his protection. You can't paint him as a monster when he keeps offering seats at the table. That's when whispers began circulating among older bosses. Some said he was too soft. Others said he was playing a longer game. But none of them could ignore the results. His territory expanded without open war. His manpower increased without recruitment drives. His influence reached industries that once refused to deal with violent syndicates. And all of it came from one consistent choice. Spare them. But not freely. Every act of public mercy came with invisible strings. Access in exchange for loyalty. Protection in exchange for silence. growth in exchange for alignment. It looked generous. It functioned as control. Which brings us to the question that even his own inner circle struggled to answer. Was this strategy a weakness? Or was it the highest form of dominance? Because if you can conquer without blood, reshape enemies without humiliating them, and expand without triggering retaliation, then maybe the most powerful weapon in the underworld isn't violence at all. Maybe it's the ability to make your enemies believe joining you was their idea. By now, it was clear this wasn't improvisation. It was a system. What looked like isolated acts of mercy were actually steps in a repeatable model, one he applied with precision. If you strip away the personalities, the emotions, the street politics, what remains is structure. Let's break it down the way a strategist would. He never chased territory first. He studied influence. Who controlled supply chains? Who influenced mid-level captains? Who had access to politicians, unions, port managers, entertainment venues? Instead of attacking the visible leader, he mapped the invisible connectors. Then he approached the connectors, sometimes with investment, sometimes with partnership, sometimes with quiet pressure. By the time he dealt with a rival boss directly, much of the surrounding ecosystem was already leaning in his direction. He didn't take buildings. He took gravity. Once influence was contained, he extended an offer. Not surrender. Elevation. A struggling gambling operator became head of regulated entertainment contracts. A smuggling coordinator became a logistics executive. A street captain became a regional director. He understood something critical. Most men don't want chaos. They want upward movement. And if you can provide a path upward, resistance softens. This is where his strategy began to resemble something far removed from alleyway confrontations. It resembled acquisition. But elevation alone isn't enough. There must be contrast. Quietly, while the offer stood on the table, alternatives began shrinking. Suppliers shifted loyalty. Credit lines tightened. Allies grew cautious. Not through spectacle, through influence. By the time a rival sat across from him deciding whether to accept the offer, the choice wasn't between freedom and submission. It was between isolation and expansion. That distinction matters, because people rarely choose submission. They choose growth. Step 4. Reshape identity. Once integrated, he didn't treat former rivals as defeated enemies. He gave them titles, responsibilities, public recognition within the organization. Identity is powerful. A man who sees himself as independent boss behaves one way. A man who sees himself as strategic partner in a larger empire behaves differently. He didn't just change their income. He changed how they saw themselves. And when identity shifts, loyalty follows. Because now protecting him meant protecting their own position. This is where many leaders fail. They convert enemies but don't watch them. He did. Financial audits, information channels, overlapping responsibilities so no one controlled an entire vertical alone. Not oppressive, just precise. Every former rival remained valuable, but never irreplaceable. And that balance kept ambition productive rather than destructive. When you look at the full system, something becomes obvious. This was less gang warfare, more structured consolidation. It mirrored hostile acquisitions in the business culture of Seoul during periods of rapid expansion. In corporate takeovers, you don't burn down the company you're acquiring. You restructure it. You keep the talent. You align incentives. You integrate leadership under new authority. He applied that same logic underground. Power insight. He turned gang war into talent acquisition. Every conflict became recruitment. Every rival became potential management. Every defeat became expansion. And then something unexpected happened. Law enforcement began struggling. Not because he became invisible, but because violence dropped. Fewer retaliatory killings. Fewer public clashes. Fewer emergency responses. The metrics they relied on, bloodshed, open disputes, street chaos, started declining. From the outside, it looked like stabilization. Reduced violence suggested fragmentation or peace. What they didn't immediately see was consolidation. When power centralizes quietly, it leaves fewer public signals. No turf wars. No headlines. just gradual concentration. And that made him harder to disrupt. Because systems built on noise are easier to track. Systems built on structure are harder to dismantle. The underworld saw dominance. Authorities saw reduced crime rates. And in between those two perceptions, his empire expanded. Which raises another uncomfortable question. If control produces order, does that make it more dangerous or more effective? By this point, most people were asking the wrong question. They kept asking how he convinced rivals to join him. The better question was this: why didn't they turn on him later? Because absorbing an enemy is one thing. Keeping them loyal is another. And he didn't rely on threats to maintain that loyalty. He relied on structure. The first mechanism was financial entanglement. When a former rival joined his network, they weren't just handed a title. They were woven into overlapping revenue streams, shared investments, joint contracts, cross-managed accounts. No one's income stood alone. If one division failed, others felt it. If one leader collapsed, several projects stalled. This wasn't generosity. It was interdependence. If a man considered rebellion, he had to calculate the cost. Not just to himself, but to the people now financially tied to him. Breaking away no longer meant risking personal loss. It meant destabilizing his own allies. That calculation changed behavior. The second mechanism was shared secrets. Integration required transparency. Former rivals disclosed old operations, hidden accounts, political connections. In exchange, they gained access to larger networks and protection. Information flowed both ways. But information binds. When multiple leaders share knowledge that could damage them all, trust becomes less about emotion and more about survival. No one wanted to pull a thread that might unravel their own position. Then came something more subtle: public redemption narratives. He didn't label former enemies as traitors who were spared. He reframed them. In meetings, he would introduce them as visionaries who chose alignment. In internal gatherings, he praised their strategic maturity. He allowed them to speak, to lead, to represent the organization publicly. Reputation matters deeply in hierarchical cultures. By restoring their public image, he gave them something they hadn't expected after defeat: dignity. And dignity is powerful. A man who feels humiliated looks for revenge. A man who feels restored looks for stability. The final layer was social elevation. Access to higher circles. Introductions to legitimate business leaders. Invitations to events previously closed to them. He moved them upward socially, not just financially. That shift reinforced a new identity. They were no longer regional operators fighting for scraps. They were part of something larger, part of an empire with reach. And here's the psychological core of it all. When someone's new identity depends on you, they protect you. Not because they are afraid, because losing you means losing who they have become. That is a deeper form of control than intimidation. Fear says, stay in line or suffer. Identity says, stay in line or you disappear. Not physically, socially, structurally, economically. Over time, rebellion stopped making sense. To revolt wasn't just to oppose him. It was to dismantle the very structure that now sustained you. That is why uprisings never gained traction. There were disagreements, tensions, ambitions, but no coordinated break. Because every ambitious man was already tied into the system in ways that made separation costly. Still, a quiet thought lingered beneath the surface. Some of the older captains began to wonder privately. They had more money, more stability, more influence than before, but they were also more dependent. Their independence had been traded for integration. Which brings us to the uncomfortable question no one voiced out loud. But was anyone truly free? For years, the system worked. Rivals were absorbed. Ambition was redirected. Violence declined. But mercy creates a quiet risk. Not everyone interprets restraint as strength. One of the men he had elevated, a former regional boss who now controlled a profitable entertainment division, began thinking differently. He had been spared publicly, promoted strategically, given contracts, access, legitimacy. Outwardly, he was loyal. Privately, he was calculating. He believed the absence of executions meant the edge had dulled. He told himself a simple story. If he won't eliminate threats, then he won't eliminate me. So he began building something parallel. Not open rebellion, an independent network, side agreements with suppliers, private understandings with mid-level captains, cash reserves kept off the shared books. He wasn't trying to overthrow the structure overnight. He was building insurance. If the day ever came when he needed to walk away, he wanted options. And that belief that mercy meant hesitation was his miscalculation. The boss didn't confront him immediately. He observed. Financial irregularities were noted. Conversations were traced. Patterns were mapped. When the moment came, there was no dramatic accusation. No late-night raid. Instead, invitations started disappearing. Key meetings took place without him. Major contracts were reassigned temporarily. 2 captains he relied on were promoted into roles that required relocation. Nothing explosive, just quiet subtraction. Within weeks, he felt it. Calls returned slower. Decisions made without consultation. Influence thinning at the edges. Then came the final move. The boss convened a private gathering of senior leaders. In that room, evidence was presented calmly. Financial discrepancies, parallel negotiations, backup arrangements. No shouting, just clarity. The former rival realized something in that moment. His secret network had never been strong enough. Because the system he tried to branch away from was the very system feeding him. The boss gave him one final choice. Not death, exile. He could leave the structure entirely, keep a portion of his assets, step away from protection, from contracts, from shared networks. He would not be hunted, but he would no longer belong. That offer landed harder than any threat. Because exile in that world wasn't freedom. It was irrelevant. No access to consolidated suppliers. No protection from regulatory pressure. No entry into the larger deals that now define the market. He wasn't being asked to die. He was being asked to disappear from power. Let's pause here. Exclusion from power can hurt more than elimination. Elimination ends your life. Exclusion ends your influence. And for men who measure themselves by reach and status, influence is oxygen. The room waited. The former rival understood what exile would mean. He would survive, but he would shrink. He chose to leave, not in chains, not under escort. He walked out with dignity intact and authority gone. The message traveled faster than any execution ever could. Mercy had limits. Integration required alignment. And stepping outside the structure didn't lead to martyrdom. It led to obscurity. No blood was spilled. No headlines were written. But dominance was reinforced. Because the underworld saw something unmistakable. He didn't need to kill to prove strength. He only needed to control who belonged. And in that world, belonging was everything. By the time his structure matured, something unusual had happened. There were fewer funerals. Fewer revenge plots. Fewer sudden disappearances that triggered chain reactions across districts. From the outside, it looked like stability. From the inside, it was consolidation. So why did this strategy work so well in a world built on retaliation? First, it reduced revenge cycles. In traditional power struggles, every execution plants a future enemy. A brother seeking justice. A loyal captain seeking balance. Violence creates memory, and memory keeps conflicts alive. But when rivals were absorbed instead of eliminated, there was no funeral to rally around. No grieving crew uniting under anger. No symbolic injustice demanding response. Conflict ended without creating a sequel. That alone reshaped the rhythm of the underworld. Second, it increased manpower. Every defeated rival brought experience, contacts, and infrastructure. He wasn't starting from zero in new territories. He was inheriting functioning networks, warehouses, venues, transport routes, political introductions. Instead of burning down what existed, he upgraded it. Every confrontation became recruitment. Every victory became expansion. Third, it created emotional indebtedness. Men who expected punishment received an opportunity. Men who expected humiliation received recognition. That reversal has weight. Gratitude mixed with obligation is powerful. It reshapes how a man interprets authority. He no longer sees himself as conquered. He sees himself as chosen. And when you feel chosen, you defend the one who chose you. Fourth, it enhanced public image. Not public in the mainstream sense. Public within the ecosystem that mattered. Business intermediaries preferred dealing with a structure that didn't erupt into open conflict. Local officials preferred stability over chaos. Investors prefer predictability. As violence declined, doors opened that would have remained closed to a volatile syndicate. He looked less like a street commander and more like an executive consolidator. That shift expanded his reach into semi-legitimate spaces. And finally, it confused enemies. Traditional bosses knew how to respond to aggression. They knew how to counter intimidation. But how do you counter elevation? If you attack him, you risk isolation. If you oppose him publicly, you risk watching your own allies defect for opportunity. His method blurred lines. Was he a rival or partner? Threat or gateway? That uncertainty slowed reaction time. And in power structures, hesitation is costly. Now here's the key lesson beneath all of it. Fear controls behavior. Redemption controls identity. Behavior changes under pressure. Identity changes under integration. A man may obey you because he fears you, but he will protect you when his position, reputation, and future are tied to your survival. Identity control lasts longer, because once someone builds their life around your system, leaving it feels like self-erasure. That is why the structure endured. Not because it was softer, not because it was kinder, but because it moved the battlefield, away from bullets, toward belonging. And in that arena, he understood something others didn't. If you control how a man sees himself, you don't need to control him every day. So now we arrive at the part no one inside his organization ever said out loud. Was he merciful? Or was he more manipulative than any killer who came before him? He didn't leave bodies behind him. He left promotions. He didn't silence enemies with violence. He repositioned them. He gave them income, status, access, relevance. But look closer. Every man he saved became tied to him, financially connected, socially elevated through his approval, defined by a role he assigned. Is that kindness? Or is that architecture? Because there's a difference between freeing someone and redesigning them. If a man expects death and you give him power instead, he will call you generous. But if that power only exists under your shadow, what did he really gain? Autonomy? Or upgraded dependency? In most criminal hierarchies, control is obvious. Comes with threats. Here, control came with opportunity. No one was forced at gunpoint. They walked in, signed agreements, accepted titles, defended the very structure that absorbed them. So ask yourself this: is sparing someone mercy, if it binds them permanently? Is giving someone a new life redemption, if that life cannot exist without you? He didn't dominate through fear. He dominated through belonging. And belonging can be more powerful than intimidation. Because when fear disappears, rebellion begins. But when identity is tied to the system, rebellion feels like self-destruction. So what was he? A reformer inside a brutal world? Or a strategist who discovered that ownership doesn't require chains? Maybe the most unsettling truth is this: the men who once tried to overthrow him eventually became his strongest defenders. Not because they were threatened, but because they were integrated. And integration, when designed carefully, can be harder to escape than force. Was that mercy? Or was it mastery of human psychology at its highest level? I'll leave that to you. In the end, the most dangerous leader isn't the one who destroys you. It's the one who rewrites you. Destruction is loud. It's immediate. It leaves evidence. Rewriting is quieter. It changes your alliances, your income, your identity, your future. You wake up one day and realize you're no longer resisting power. You're operating inside it. That was his real weapon. Not intimidation, not chaos, direction. He didn't push people down. He redirected them. And when you control direction, you don't need to control every action. Because the system moves where you designed it to move. That's the lesson beneath the story. Power is not about force. Force is temporary. Power is about control of direction. is about shaping the choices available to others, until the choice you prefer feels like the smartest one. Some leaders rule through fear, others rule through reward. The rare ones understand structure, and structure outlasts emotion. So as you think about his method, don't just see the underworld. Look at the pattern, where influence is captured, where alternatives quietly disappear, where identity becomes alignment. That's where real dominance operates. If you want to understand how real power works, not just in crime but in systems, watch the next analysis.